Before social media icons, before algorithms decided who was cool and who wasn't, before the internet handed out fame like candy at Halloween, there was a real 90s icon, not manufactured, not focus grouped, not carefully curated for mass consumption. She was pale and dark-haired and looked at the camera like she already knew all your secrets. She wore vintage dresses to award shows when everyone else was in couture. She read actual books. She quoted Salinger in interviews. And somehow, without trying to be anything at all, she became everything a generation needed her to be. Her name was Winona Ryder, and if you lived through the 90s with any kind of sensitivity, any kind of ache in your chest that you couldn't quite explain, she was yours. There's something almost cinematic about how Winona entered the world's imagination. Not with a bang, but with a quiet, smoldering intensity that crept up on you slowly, like fog rolling off a California highway at dusk. She didn't burst onto screens, she materialized. Born Winona Laura Horowitz in 1971 in Winona, Minnesota, she grew up on a commune in Northern California surrounded by counterculture thinkers, artists, and intellectuals. Her godfather was Timothy Leary. Her parents were Bohemian scholars. She was raised on a diet of literature, philosophy, and the kind of radical thinking that doesn't make you famous. It makes you interesting. And Winona Ryder was, above all things, interesting in a way that Hollywood rarely produces and almost never understands. By the time the 1980s were gasping their last materialistic breaths, Winona was already carving out space for herself in cinema. She had that rare quality. Call it presence, call it depth, call it the inexplicable weight of a soul that seems to have lived many lives, where you couldn't look away from her even when she was doing nothing, especially when she was doing nothing. Her eyes, dark and enormous and perpetually searching, told stories that her dialogue didn't need to. Directors noticed. Audiences noticed. And then came the film that would cement her place in the mythology of modern cinema. Tim Burton's Edward Scissorhands arrived in 1990 like a fever dream dressed in pastels. A gothic fairy tale dropped into the cheerful suburban nightmare of middle America. It was exactly the kind of film that shouldn't have worked. And yet it worked completely, devastatingly, in a way that still makes grown adults cry if they think about it too hard on a rainy afternoon. Winona played Kim Boggs, the golden girl of the neighborhood, the pretty cheerleader with the boyfriend who didn't deserve her and the heart that was quietly, persistently open to something more. What could have been a paper-thin role, the love interest, the object of the outsider's adoration, became something luminous in her hands. She played Kim with a kind of slow awakening, a gradual peeling back of the ordinary to reveal something tender and brave underneath. There is a scene, quiet, almost unbearably so, where Kim stands in a shower of ice shavings falling from Edward's Scissorhands, spinning in the cold artificial snow with her eyes closed and her face tilted upward, and in that moment Winona Ryder communicates more about wonder and longing and the particular heartbreak of loving someone the world won't accept than most actors communicate in an entire career. She was 20 years old. The pairing of Winona and Burton felt almost inevitable in retrospect, the way all great artistic collaborations feel inevitable once you've witnessed them. She was drawn to the dark, the strange, the emotionally complex. She had no interest in the clean narrative arc, the happy ending delivered on schedule, the heroine who never doubts herself. She wanted the mess. She wanted the ache. And Burton, bless him, gave her exactly that. Their collaboration produced films that didn't just entertain audiences. They became emotional landmarks. Films people returned to not for the plot, but for the feeling, that specific atmosphere of beautiful melancholy that Winona seemed to carry inside her like weather. But it was 1994 that would become the defining year of the Winona Ryder mythology. Ben Stiller's Reality Bites hit theaters and detonated quietly in the hearts of an entire generation of young people who were trying to figure out who they were in a world that kept asking them to be something more profitable. The film was sharp and funny, and achingly honest about the gap between the dreams you graduate with and the reality that meets you at the door. Winona played Lelena Pierce, a documentary filmmaker armed with a camcorder and a refusal to sell out, navigating her early 20s in Houston with a circle of friends who were brilliant and broke and terrified of becoming their parents. She was, in every sense, the voice of Generation X's feminine soul. Skeptical, romantic, furious at mediocrity. Too smart for her own comfort, desperately in love with someone who wasn't necessarily good for her and knowing it and doing it anyway because the heart is not a particularly rational organ. What made Winona's Lelena resonate so deeply wasn't just the relatability of the circumstances. It was the emotional honesty she brought to the performance. She never played Lelena as a victim or a saint. She played her as a person, complicated, sometimes selfish, often confused, occasionally brilliant, always searching. There's a kind of courage in that kind of acting, the courage to resist the clean read, to let the character be contradictory and human and therefore true. Winona understood intuitively that the most powerful thing an actor can do is refuse to be likable on demand, to let the audience meet the character in the middle rather than hand them something prepackaged and easy to digest. She never handed anyone anything prepackaged. That was not her style. The 90s were, in many ways, the decade that belonged to the outsider, or at least to the romantic idea of the outsider. Grunge had dragged rock music out of the arena and into the garage. Independent cinema was exploding with voices that Hollywood hadn't manufactured and couldn't quite control. And in the middle of all this beautiful, slightly disheveled cultural upheaval, Winona Ryder was the face that fit. She was alternative in the truest sense of the word. Not as a pose, not as a marketing strategy, but as an authentic orientation toward the world. She wore vintage because she actually loved vintage. She read because she actually loved reading. She seemed uncomfortable with the machinery of celebrity, with the red carpets and the profiles and the performance of being a star, in a way that made you trust her completely. There was also something genuinely mysterious about her. In an era before celebrities documented their every breakfast and emotional fluctuation for public consumption, Winona kept large parts of herself private. Not in a calculated way, she didn't seem strategic enough for calculation, but in the way of someone who simply understands that some interior life is too precious to share with strangers. She gave interviews that were thoughtful and often surprising, and then she went home and presumably read a book. She dated famously. Her engagement to Johnny Depp became one of the defining celebrity relationships of the early 90s, romantic and volatile, and doomed in that way that great romances sometimes are, the kind of thing that produces both beautiful tattoos and expensive tattoo removal. But even then, the relationship felt somehow private, not consumed by the public so much as glimpsed. Her filmography during this period reads like a love letter to emotional complexity. Heathers had already established, before the decade even turned, that she could play dark comedy with a razor's edge. Mermaids gave her cheer as a mother and the particular texture of a childhood spent being different. The Age of Innocence put her in a Scorsese period piece where she held her own against Daniel Day-Lewis in a performance of quiet, devastating restraint. Little Women brought her Jo March, bookish and fierce and refusing marriage and convention with a passion that felt entirely unmistakably modern. And through all of it, period pieces and the indie films and the mainstream successes, she remained distinctly, uncompromisingly herself. The characters changed, but the quality didn't. That gravity, that depth, that sense that there was always more happening beneath the surface than the script was showing you. To understand why Winona Ryder mattered, really mattered, in the way that certain artists become embedded in the emotional architecture of a generation. You have to understand what she represented to a particular kind of young person in the 90s. If you were someone who felt slightly sideways to the world, who loved books more than parties, who felt things too deeply and couldn't always explain why, who suspected that the mainstream version of happiness being sold to you was missing something essential, Winona was proof that there was another way to exist, that you could be successful and strange, that you could be beautiful and bookish, that you could refuse to simplify yourself and still find your place in the world. She wasn't aspirational in the conventional sense. She was something rare. She was recognizable. She was the mirror that showed a certain kind of person themselves, reflected back with dark eyes and impeccable cheekbones. But the late 90s brought turbulence, as decades often do when they're winding down and the cultural mood is shifting. Winona's later 90s work was uneven, not because her talent had diminished, but because the kind of films she made best were becoming harder to finance in an era of increasingly corporate studio logic. And then the early 2000s arrived with a public stumble that the tabloids consumed with a hunger that was unpleasant to watch. The shoplifting incident at Saks Fifth Avenue in 2001, the trial that followed, the coverage that was notably less kind than it would have been had she been a male star in similar circumstances. It was a low moment, handled by the media with something between fury and stupidity, and it effectively put her career on pause for the better part of a decade. But here's the thing about genuinely talented people. They tend to come back, not always loudly, sometimes quietly, almost sideways, in a role that reminds you why you loved them in the first place, and makes you slightly embarrassed that you ever forgot. For Winona, the first stage of the return was marked by smaller, carefully chosen work, roles that showed she hadn't lost any of it, that the depth was still there, that the instrument had been maintained even when it wasn't being played publicly. And then came Stranger Things, that enormous, warm, beautifully nostalgic love letter to the 80s of everyone's childhood, in which Winona Ryder played Joyce Byers, a mother so ferocious in her love for her missing son that she strung Christmas lights across her living room and taught herself to read the signals from another dimension. It was, in a strange way, a homecoming. A whole new generation discovered her, and the generation that had grown up with her in the 90s remembered, all at once and with considerable emotion, exactly why she had always mattered. Because that's the thing about Winona Ryder that separates her from celebrities who are merely famous. She didn't offer audiences glamour or aspiration or the comfortable fantasy of a life more perfect than their own. She offered something stranger and more valuable. She offered emotional reality. She offered the experience of watching someone feel things genuinely, deeply, without apology, in a medium that often rewards the performance of feeling over the real thing. She made the outsider feel seen. She made the sensitive feel less alone. She made the slightly strange feel beautiful. And in an era before every young person had a platform and a community and an algorithm designed to show them their own reflection, in an era when you were genuinely on your own to figure out who you were and whether that person had any value, that mattered enormously. There is a quality to the best of Winona Ryder's work that resists easy description. It's something to do with the impression she creates that her characters are always thinking,
always feeling, always engaged in some interior process that the camera is only partially capturing. It makes her performances feel intimate in a way that is almost unsettling. You feel watching that you are getting away with something, that you are seeing more than you were supposed to, that some barrier between performer and audience has been quietly dissolved, and you are sitting with a real person in a real moment of real feeling. That is not a common gift. It is, in fact, extraordinarily rare. And Winona Ryder has carried it her entire career with the slightly abstracted grace of someone who doesn't quite know she has it. Which is, of course, precisely why it works. Before social media icons, before personal brands, before the careful construction of an online self designed to be maximally appealing to the maximum number of people, it was a dark-haired girl from a California commune who read too much and felt too deeply and looked at the camera with those enormous, searching eyes and somehow made an entire generation feel less alone in their strangeness. The 90s have been over for a quarter century now. The nostalgia for them is sometimes shallow, sometimes commercial, often manufactured by people who didn't live through them and are selling an aesthetic rather than a memory. But Winona Ryder isn't an aesthetic. She's something that doesn't go out of style because it was never really in style to begin with. She was always just true. And the truth, as it turns out, has remarkable staying power.